We are getting going on all of this. This is going to be a whole thing. Let me make sure this is the right screen and setup. The other thing. Come on. Failing to switch over. Frustrating. Okay. We will swap this out. Here's the right screen. Why is that not letting me show the other? Interesting. Very odd. It's not letting me share the fucking right screen. That's some frustrating shit right there. See if this works better. There it goes. All right. That's zoomed in right. So, hello everyone. Welcome to the Deleuze Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. We're actually making our way, and it's bittersweet, to the end of section 3, chapter 3, whatever. The end of really the brunt of the book, as we made our way through not just the sort of material history of psychoanalysis, but their critique of it, as well as a universal history of everything in line with desiring production and sort of rethinking all of those things. It's a bear of a thing to make it through. We're in the last section of chapter 3, Oedipus at last. And it feels like today's a good day for this. One, because it really is, it's going to be a stressful day overall. This is a fun chapter because it's ultimately recapitulating a whole bunch of shit we've kind of come across. There's not a lot of new ideas introduced here. This is just, again, going over a lot of this, going back over Oedipus, rethinking how Oedipus functions, how these things work, blah, 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 this kind of thing, which I'm jazzed for, personally. With that, I'll open it up. If there's any questions, any notes, anything that anyone's curious about, feel free to drop a text, or you hear if you're here in Discord, discord.gg/DGQC. If you got anything left, you're free to join and say, Drew, there, nice to see you. How you doing? But if no one has anything, you can unmute if you'd like, but otherwise I'll just go ahead and dive in. Excellent. In the territorial, or even the despotic machine, social economic reproduction is never independent of human reproduction, of the social form of this reproduction. The family is therefore an open praxis, a strategy that is coextensive with the social field. The relations of filiation and alliance are dominant, or rather determined as dominant. As a matter of fact, what is marked or inscribed on the socius directly is the producers or non-producers, according to the standing of their family or their standing inside of the family. The reproduction process is not directly economic, but passes by way of the non-economic factors of kinship. This is true not only with respect to the territorial machine and to local groups that determine the place of each member in social economic reproduction, according to one's status from the standpoint of the alliances and the filiations, but also with respect to the despotic machine, which adds the relations of the new alliance and direct filiation to the old alliance and filiations, whence the role of the sovereign's family in despotic overcoding and that of the dynasty, whatever its mutations, its indecisions, which are inscribed under the same category of new alliance. The process by no means remains the same in the capitalist system. Representation no longer relates to a distinct object, but to productive activity itself. The socius as full body has become directly economic as capital money. It does not tolerate any other preconditions. What is inscribed or marked is no longer the producers or non-producers, but the forces and means of production as abstract quantities that become effectively concrete in their becoming related or their conjunction. Labor capacity or capital, constant capital or variable capital, capital of filiation or capital of alliance. Capital has taken upon itself the relations of alliance and filiation. There ensures a privatization of the family, according to which the family ceases to give its social form to economic reproduction. It is as though disinvested, placed outside the field. In the language of Aristotle, the family is now simply the form of human matter or material that finds itself subordinated to the autonomous social form of economic reproduction and that comes to take the place assigned by it later. By the latter, sorry. That is to say, it is a very long paragraph. That is to say that the elements of production and anti-production, the elements of production and anti-production are not reproduced in the same way as humans themselves, but find in them a simple material that the form of economic reproduction pre-organizes in a mode that is entirely distinct from the form this material has as human reproduction. Precisely because it is privatized, placed outside the field, the form of the material or the form of the human reproduction begets people whom one can readily assume to be all equal in relation to one another, but inside the field itself, the form of social economic reproduction has already preformed the form of the material so as to engender, there where they are needed, the capitalist as a function derived from capital and the worker as a function derived from labor capacity, etc., in such a way that the family finds itself countersected by an order of classes. In this sense, indeed, segregation is the only origin of equality. Fucking long ass. It's gonna be a lot to go through. We'll take it sentence by sentence, sort of up front. I think that's probably the only way to really do it today. In the territorial or even the despotic machine, social economic reproduction is never independent of human reproduction of the social form of this reproduction. They mean this fairly plainly on its surface. In the territorial, the earth socius, the primitive pre-societal, prehistorical cultures, or even in the despotic machine, the world of despots, kings, pharaohs, godheads, whatever. Social economic reproduction, the way we socially interact and have economic reproduction, is actually never really separate from human reproduction. These things are one and the same. The way that a family would marry off their daughter or make the trade of a daughter for mules and alliances with other families. The family and the social economic space, they go together. You work together. They work together. They come together. Again, I recommend reading Strauss, and if better, read Godelier's sort of critique of Strauss and his work, Metamorphosis of Kinship, where he very deeply goes into this, and I'm not going to have time to do it, but it's fairly, I think, intuitive to talk about it this way. People have families in these cultures. They marry them off or they marry into other families, and these families are now allied. They work together. They share land. They share things. They socially work with reproduction in the same way that they work in the economic world of reproduction. The family is therefore an open practice, a strategy, coexistive with the social field. Who your family is, who they can marry, how many daughters or sons of what age, of working age, of capabilities, those things are coextensive with the social field. The relations of filiation and alliance are determinate, or rather, determined as dominant. So the filiative and alliant relations are what ultimately sort of determine your place, everyone's place within these social circles. That makes sense so far to everybody? That's what they're getting at? I know it's a lot, but they're kind of revisiting a lot in a single paragraph. They're kind of doing a speed run of chapter 3. So this is like everything chapter 3, and then they're going to do chapter 2, I think, really fast here too. So there's a lot happening in this chapter, and there's a lot of big fucking paragraphs. So with this bit, and then move on. As a matter of fact, what is marked or inscribed on the socius directly is the producers according to the standing of their family or the standing inside the family. The way that it is marked on the socius, the literal carving on the earth that happens is from the producers of these families. That's actually like, think of it as a record book in actual time, in actual space, materially, directly. The standing of their family, the standing inside the family, they're the ones marking. What is marked or inscribed is the producers. The reproduction process is not directly economic. Again, not directly economic, but passes by way of the non-economic factors of kinship. We're not quite with an economy yet. An economy is sort of the meta story of why things are done. Instead, it's emergent and determined by these social conditions that are sort of birthed upwards, right? The non-economic factors of kinship. It's not only in territorial, blah, 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 but also to the alliant. I'm going to say that. I'm not going to explain what they're talking about here because they're basically saying it's both of these. This seems to be the case in both. The process, by no means, this process of how people are socially determined, how we find our place in society, et cetera, this does not work the same in the capitalist system. This is completely different. Representation no longer relates to a distinct object, but productive activity itself. This is the last two sections as we've kind of made our way in. The image of a thing is no longer directly constitutive of the thing it's referring to. This is not the sign and signifier of Saussure. This is not the master signifier of the Khan. Instead, under capital, it instead refers to sort of the very process of its own sort of creation and the process of its own manufacture. The way that they sort of talk about it, representation no longer relates to a distinct object, but to productive activity itself. The socius as full body has become directly economic as capital money. It does not tolerate any other preconditions. Capital, which is the socius, the nature of capital itself, what capital is, how capital is written into. The socius as full body is directly economic as capital money. I have a great PDF up. If you haven't had a chance to read Holland, I recommend it. The way Holland talks about economic versus other things, I think is really solid. Let me make sure I get to the right page. One sec. So economics, as Holland is talking about it here, and I'm just going to we're going to read a little bit of his guide to Anti-Oedipus, which I think helps with this paragraph and the rest of this. Economics is the thing capital introduces, where we talk about the things are worth in a large scale sort of almost scientific objective, and I'm putting that in quotes way. Things are worth X number of dollars. Things are worth this. Things are worth X. The quantification, this is an economic sort of way of viewing the world. Savagery, as he talked about it, is primitive communism, pre-caste, pre-class form of social organization, where power is diffused through a community rather than concentrated in one group or individual. Yet, because of the absence of economics, savagery is also the social form governed by the most exacting codes of conduct, belief, and meaning. Under despotism, by contrast, differential codes of conduct, belief, and meaning are promulgated precisely in order to establish caste divisions and hierarchy, and are bent to the service of overt political power and direct imperial domination, unalleviated by the freedoms that become possible in an economic society. This is the tension between these, as they're talking about it here. When we move into an economic system, we actually have a very different beast of a thing. With this, the socius as full body becomes directly economic. The socius is infused in the trade, in production, in everything that happens. So suddenly it's not the codes that actually derive a thing's true meaning, or it's not the words from God on high or a king on high that derive a thing's true meaning. No, the socius is there direct. It doesn't tolerate other preconditions. What is inscribed or marked, back to AO, what is inscribed or marked, sorry, what is inscribed or marked is no longer the producers or non-producers. Not the point, but the forces and means of production as abstract quantities that become effectively concrete in their becoming abstract, in their becoming related or their conjunction. Actually, a lot happening here, but this is an important sort of sentence as I read it. What is inscribed or marked? Sorry, go for it, JK. Oh, two seconds, sorry. 2 seconds, sorry. I want to make sure I'm for some reason this is not. Can you talk for me just 2 seconds? Sorry, JK. Just say hi or something. Just say hi.
Hello.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Sorry, I want to make sure this gets to the recording. Apologies.
Yeah, thanks. So I want to ask, does the socius, does that take in any way take over the role as some form of a master signifier, like this superego, or I mean, it is like the superego of Freud's system, right?
It is under the despot, yes, I would say so. Under the despotic, it plays more of that role. And again, this is how the meaning shifts when we have a sort of a very contextual, in the primitive form, when people see graphisms or speak, it's who they're speaking to in the context of the time of day, location, who else is there. All these things sort of affect what is said or what that graphism is doing. It's literally changing its meaning kind of constantly depending on that. The despot, when he speaks, is the master signifier. What he says is that. So when he speaks, that voice on high, the voice of God that is expected, or again, the written word, which implies the sort of singular voice behind it, the true voice of the author, the true voice of God, the true voice of the king, who's putting out edicts saying, don't hunt in my blah, 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 don't do this, here's an edict from this, I got married here. That your job as a citizen, as a subject of this, is to divine what is being said, right? And so you do that by learning the master's signification, by learning the sort of Lacanian way of looking at things, which is the master signifier and the chain of meaning that extends from that. Capital doesn't do that, though. Capital doesn't have a singular true meaning. There is no version of that, because in capital, what is inscribed or marked is not producers or non-producers, which it was. There were very specific delineated lines. The king was the producer and the despot, for example. But now, not that. Instead, capital is really about forces or means of productions that become concrete in their becoming related or their conjunction. The way that things come together in the time they do and they conjunct determines the actual value of the thing, the meaning of the thing, which doesn't really have a master signifier. It doesn't really have a king on high who's denoting this or claiming this. Instead, it is very much in that moment of conjunction, as they give examples: labor, capacity, or capital, constant capital, or variable. These are all instances of capital, but they're not the same thing. They don't have the same meaning at all, and it doesn't come on high from a god. Instead, it's how it's instantiated and the conjunct of all of the parts of production that produce it. What makes constant capital or variable capital is how it is spent when it is spent. Otherwise it's just capital. Capital affiliation or alliance, how it's spent, how it's used, how it's actualized. It's until then, it's almost a virtual element. It moves into the space of becoming actual. So this thing that happens because of this, everything goes through capital. Everything becomes part of capital. Your worth, your location in society, where you're at, all of it is determined by capital. But that's the fucked up thing, is it's not determined by capital through you. It's capital in and of itself and the location of capital. That's it. So it's this really fascinating sort of fucked up thing where it doesn't have the master signifier. It gets rid of that. It's one of the things capital wants to get rid of.
Right, right. It doesn't have a master signifier, but then it is the market forces of capital money that becomes a kind of like a superego. You know, that someone that has power to determine how one thinks and behaves.
It's
You
not
know,
far from that, but again, superego in the Freudian sense, and again, correct me if you have a different understanding this, but superego is, like for Freud, that that lawful good God voice, the master signifier, effectively. But it's a locus. There's a position of superego, versus with capital, it is actually within all. It's distributed, and all the pieces. Like we went through the semiotics of capital and discussed sort of in the previous section how it's not really even about words. It's not about whole images. It's about pieces. It's about the smallest pieces possible, because we need to be able to quantify and have these things become fungible. $1, a dollar that is spent to hire a hitman doesn't have any value or meaning to it, because the next day it could be spent to buy cancer meds for a needy child. Dollar doesn't give a fuck. Dollar is fungible. And all dollars are this way. All capital is this way, because it's ultimately the tiniest parts. So it's only in the conjunction where it becomes $80 billion to buy this, $8 million to buy this, $220 to buy this. Only in that moment of concretization does it actually become a thing. And only in that moment is it granted that meaning. Only in that conjunction. Right?
but also capital is also the foundation for oligarchy, right? And in the oligarchy, isn't there this hierarchy of value, a hierarchy of power?
Well, this is the parts of capitalism. This is where it's fun. Is it in capital? Capital doesn't really give a shit about any of those things, but the state does. And the state in capital, which again, just to go back to Marx, kind of a big deal. The state is as much responsible for capitalism as anything. The idea of state and capital not being intertwined is sort of silly. And that's part of what's sort of these anachronisms that they refer to, these sort of odd, out of time things that seem like, well, geez, we have all this. Why do we still have the state? Well, it's because of this, this, and this. And the state ensures these things. Well, we also have, and again, this is where, and we're getting to that because we're getting to Oedipus, but how representation has made itself continue to work inside of this space, because we don't have whole bodies. We no longer have that. We don't have the denoting of a specific thing. We have this weird fuzziness that happens inside of the sort of the molecular. Well, then how do we have representation? Well, it's actually through this axiomatizing sort of secondary action. Again, capital goes through its process to completely break everything down to dollars, but then also axiomatizes and creates that sort of next step, the presumed end goal. And through that, we find Oedipus. Did that help at all, JK?
Yeah, it does. And I'm just wondering how the Oedipus is a kind of isn't that a return to a kind of a master signifier?
It's a return to a kind of structure. It's a and this is where, and it's going to be fun when we finally get to this. It's in this section. But so the book being called Anti-Oedipus, they're not really striking at the heart of Oedipus. It's not the entire goal. Oedipus is just a perfect example of what they're going to be talking about with their critique of representation. Because Oedipus, as it functions, builds into us an axiomatizing preset of how the world is seen. So it's not really a master signifier, but instead an axiomatizing process that determines how desire is able to function. And it's a big difference. A master signifier is one which we use exegesis to sort of determine what they're saying through interpretation and trying to figure it out and like, oh, what does this mean? Whereas the opposite is kind of what is functional inside of capital, where we find these sort of part meanings, piece meanings, built out meanings that are part of the production process. And instead of looking on high for really what these things mean, we're looking through the conjunct of what they mean. So it's a shift, but it does seem like it is, because it feels like it's coming from on high. But capital is suffused with anti-production and production and all of these things that do this. And so capital functions, again, differently, because it is this hyper-quantification process, not a king on high dropping a handful of notes of how to do things.
So Oedipus is a subordinate to the capitalist money
Oh,
process,
yes.
right?
Oh, yes. Yeah, capital's a bitch, man. Capital's something else. Well, that's kind of where they get to next. Capital has taken upon itself the relations of alliance and filiation. Through capital, alliance and filiation is determined. Almost entirely, like as far as I can say, entirely. There ensues a privatization of the family, according to which the family ceases to give its social form to economic reproduction. It is as though disinvested, placed outside the field. In the language of Aristotle, the family is now simply the form of human matter or material that finds itself subordinated to the autonomous social form of economic reproduction, and that comes to take the place assigned it by the latter. So again, pre-capital, the family was everything. Family was everything. Primitive societies, the family was everything. Now, again, not necessarily a nuclear family. You have to remember what family meant in different ways, but your filiative line was everything, and your alliances were everything. Who you worked with, like, these things mattered extraordinarily. Even in the despotic, family meant everything. Of course, the family was the king, queen, prince, and royal blood, or fiefdom, or whatever it is, and the alliances were with other kingdoms, and you either loved or hated a race of people based on this. But this was the family. This is family. This is the filiative alliance. This has mattered so much. And capital just obliterates that. But it doesn't destroy the family. It obliterates its position. It rebuilds it in a different way. This thing that happens is the privatization of the family. Instead of being the thing that is determining social positioning. And again, as they open this, the family was coextensive with the social field. It kind of still is, but it's not determinant of it. It doesn't determine your position. Instead, we have the after image of the family almost, that is almost here for momentum more than anything else. There's this odd thing that the family does. The family's not invested in the social world anymore. You're not going to do exactly what your parents said you have to do. You're not born into a certain caste family. Your family's friends, like, how many of us even give a shit about family friends? Like, it doesn't exist in the same way. These things have sort of gone and become this after image, the form of human matter or material that is subordinated to the autonomous social form of economic reproduction. It's a great way to describe the family now versus what it was. That is to say, the elements of production and anti-production are not reproduced in the same way as humans themselves, but find in them, in the humans, a simple material that the form of economic reproduction pre-organizes in a mode that is entirely distinct from the form this material has as human reproduction. This is finds desire. The elements of production and production are not reproduced the same way as humans themselves. They don't have children. They don't reproduce. It's not a one-to-one. This is not family. But instead, in family, in humans, it finds simple material in the form of economic reproduction that can be pre-organized, that can be preset in a very particular way that is distinct from the form this material has as human reproduction. Precisely because it is privatized, placed outside the field, outside the social field. The form of the material, or the form of human reproduction, begets people whom one can readily assume to be all equal in relation to one another. Inside the field itself, the form of social economic reproduction has already preformed the form of the material so as to engender, where they are needed, the capitalist, the worker, etc., 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 in such a way that the family finds itself countersected by the order of classes. Last bit is, they're going to open up in the next paragraph as well, but I want to make sure we take a second because it's a beast. Because the family is privatized, moved into private, it is no longer coextensive with the social field. Family's not, just not. Now, if you want, again, Metamorphosis of Kinship, I can grab it off a shelf. You can see its beautiful hand. Beautiful book, lovely hardcover. It is fantastic. It's out of Verso. I absolutely think it's one of my favorite versions of this. What Godelia goes through, that's just gorgeous, is very much this, is the way kinship has shifted over time. And this is not them coming up with something new necessarily here. This is Godelier. This is kind of Strauss. This is an anthropological turn. It's fairly common to talk through how family has changed. Their switch is to talk about it in terms of how the production recording happens, the recording of production, the Marxist sort of way. And so now that the family is no longer coextensive with the social field, and it was, once upon a time, who you were born to determined a lot, and your family was basically who determined who you were going to be able to fuck, who could fuck you, and where your alliance is. Like, it's an intense coextensive relationship between family and social field. Now the family's private, completely private. Kids are homeschooled. They don't even really go to school anymore. A lot of kids don't. And even if they do, really, it's a babysitting for them. And parents don't really get together with other kids. Maybe they do in particular place, but they choose when to do it. The parents choose because ultimately their family is their family. I get to make the choice. It's mine, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine, blah, blah, blah. It's no longer coextensive with the social field in that it determines who you're connected to and how. It doesn't. Things don't really matter in the same way. So now that we are privatized, sorry, go for it, JK.
Oh, just talking about privatized family. Is that another term that Deleuze uses for the nuclear family, as opposed to the extended family?
I wouldn't exchange them freely. The privatized family would include the extended family in capital. It has to do with again how the social field is set up and how it's determined. Under the previous two socii, your family was the determinant social field. They were coextensive. And like the Godelier and Strauss have these little pegs that they put in. They're like, here's a family lineage, and it's a plus or minus sort of polarity for people. And Strauss had these really complex diagrams of these tribes. And you could actually map an entire tribe based on kind of their people's relationships within their family and the relationship of families to other people. That thing was coextensive. It coexisted with the rest of everything in the social world. That's not the case. Now the family is sectioned off. They are separated. The family's production doesn't matter. If you have boys or girls, it doesn't matter. If you have smart or young, like these things kind of don't matter in determining like where someone's placed in the social field. A great example would be if a family only ever had girls way back when, you would end up seeing them allied with a lot of different tribes, but their name would kind of disappear. This doesn't really happen anymore, and it's not thought of at all the same way. The discussion around it is different. The way that it happens is different. It's not coextensive. It's part of the social field, but it's privatized, it's separated, it's sectioned off completely. It's placed elsewhere. The material forms that matter, which is the human, the person underneath that begets people whom one can readily assume to be equal. All these things, because these people are born outside of the social field, we have that neoliberal idea of everyone being born equal, instead of being born into castes, which still happens in some places in the world. But again, this is a difference. This is how this is not coextensive with the social field. The caste isn't where you're born. Not really. But inside the field itself, there's this weird thing that happens that we still have that bisecting. But it's not really by family, it's by capital. The families you're born to, things like that, it's not set up the same way. Does that make sense? Okay?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thanks. Yeah. That makes sense.
Okay. Kind of a bear.
All right. What was the question again?
Say again?
What was the question?
We were discussing the nature of the family as being private versus being part of the social field and the difference between them.
Okay.
When Deleuze talks of precisely because the family is privatized, is he talking of the nuclear family, the extended family, and all that? He's talking about all of it. And he's talking about sort of the relationship of the family as a thing to the social field, that it's either coextensive, as it was, or it's private now, where, well, it's still bisected through it. It does exist specifically outside of the social field. We don't have the same setup for castes in the same way, a lot of that thing. Not in the same setup, determined differently.
Hoping to sneak in a question here.
Go for it, Josh.
You hear me?
Yes, you're very muffled though. Like it's loud, but it's mumbly. Sorry.
Okay.
Oh, that's better. Never mind.
Already. Earlier you said in answer to JK's question that Oedipus is subordinate to capital, which would then, I would assume, mean that psychoanalysis is subordinate to capital.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in terms of kind of its, I don't know if you'd call it condition of possibility, but all right. So I'm leading in a particular direction here. Psychoanalysis emerged in the era of the development of the human sciences. What if we were then to say that the human sciences, in their development and their emergence, were also subordinate to capital? The reason that I'm going in this direction is that I've been comparing it to Foucault's analysis of epistemes in the order of things, where he lays out, okay, in a particular episteme, in a particular epic, we've got a notion of what linguistics consisted of, and natural history and biology and the human sciences, and then he devotes an analysis to taxonomics and Marx and Ricardo and various other figures. So in that analysis, the impression is that he gives equal billing to each of these segments of culture. And I don't get the impression that he makes something, I could be wrong, but that he makes capital superordinate to any of these.
I don't think Foucault does either. I would agree with you. I don't think Foucault does that. He might say something along the lines of everything being sort of submissive to power, but I don't think he would even phrase it that way. So like him talking about capital in this way, I would agree. He talked about how he hated this book and a lot of shit Deleuze did afterwards. So even though he did write the intro for this, but I hate his intro, so.
Yeah, so that's an interesting distinction between the two of them. And of course, Deleuze never really submitted Marx to sharp critique. He submitted various Marxism to critique. And just before his death, he said his next book was going to be all about Marx.
Apparently had a good amount of it done too, so it's sitting out there somewhere.
Yeah, whereas Foucault did submit. So that's okay. That's what I was wondering. That is an interesting distinction between the two of them.
Yeah. So for Deleuze, and again Deleuze and Foucault for sure on these points never saw eye to eye. Foucault spoke openly about how he could never get the idea of desire existing without lack as production, which is, I mean, the basis of Guattari's machinic unconscious. So you can just say they're fairly incompatible. They tend to land in a lot of the same places, though, which is what is always fascinating. But specifically for Deleuze, the reason that capital is the thing, and again, to go back to what a socius really is you're talking about the recording process itself, right? Right? So like when we talk about the recording process of X, Y, or Z, and we're saying, oh, it's in a Marxist sense, primitive societies, they would literally record everything in the earth, where they dug, where they walked, where they hunted, where they made houses, where they built homes, where they traveled, whatever it is, you would actually record in the earth. I mean, they didn't call it that, but like that's how we know what a lot of them did, because they literally recorded a lot of their culture in the fucking earth, and they scarred the earth, and they scarred each other, and like this process as a thing to them actually fell back on their own production, their own myths, and then Deleuze and Guattari go into length here, but they get it from not just Godelier, but oh, what the hell is his name? Sorry, I have it right here. Griol and another guy I really like. Anyway, they get these from a few others, but then they notice at the same time the inscription, what is being recorded, and the thing everyone credits for production. And this is again the Marxist turn, where Marx is saying that this is people credit capital for production. And so for them, how does this crediting of production, this thing that seemingly controls production, that seemingly is actually doing the thing, that's actually only the end of the process. Capital is the recording of labor. That's what it is. It's we make capital because we have people being paid for work. Their work has value. That value is output. We have a value. That value is capital. And this is being recorded. This is a recording. We have a bunch of money being made. But money's not being made by money. It's being made by labor. So where does this illusion come about? Where does this quasi-cause weirdness that capital does come about? And for them, they drive back to this, looking through all of these things in terms of specifically the larger superstructure. It's as Deleuze would probably say, it's more Marx than Marx, where it's like, what is the superstructure of the recording itself? Not just looking at society, because society is one thing, but is there a way for us to take a look at that same critique of production and put it in production and say, actually, in people, the same thing's happening? That the same type of production that's happening at that meta level is actually happening at the personal level. And here's how these things come into be. And so this is the thrust of where they disagree with Foucault, because for Foucault, power necessarily is diffuse, great, but it does derive from more of a Freudian, Lacanian sort of production of desire that is born of lack, necessarily. It's born of a negative. It's born of our inability to experience the real or communicate the real or whatever it may be. It's born of a negative. For Deleuze and Guattari, the negative is actually born of the affirming, that we're born of difference and identity that is repeated. And that affirming of identity through repetition produces lack through the way that representation falls back on itself, the way that we mistake things for their representative. And that negative is produced. It is not a negative that's sort of born of things. So for Deleuze and Guattari, they want to have the conversation in a different way and talk through how do we find this affirming structure that builds the lack, that builds the thing that allows lack to be produced, that allows these things to exist in this negative light. This is to me, this is how I understand the core difference between them. And you end up, and that's my favorite thing actually, is you end up in a way that most of their writings are, I don't want to say fungible, this is not the right word, but it's not like they end up in different places drastically. Like the order of things is something that 100% you can build into anything Deleuze wrote. And I think most of Deleuze's writing you can build into what Foucault wrote. It's really fascinating. Deleuze takes it in Foucault, the La Reviste, the book he writes on Foucault, and he turns it into this sort of magnum opus on Foucault's work. It's worth reading. If you haven't read Foucault by Deleuze, it's wonderful. And it's actually like maybe to me, that's my fucking middle little line, but it's that really fantastic concept that's built in there for the first time of the diagrammatic, which is this idea of the superstructure's superstructure, like a procedural superstructure that has a structure to itself, which is really where a lot of this other stuff is meant to be going. For example, the idea of, and he's talking about it in here, but the idea of capital and being within social production and how social production operates, and the axiomatic, which is ultimately about that, and how the axiomatic determines where we land, because it is conditioning all production that happens inside of it, which is what capital does. We don't just do whatever inside capital. Some people are allowed to, that's great. But the reality is that capital's conditioning everything, and capital has very particular goals. We do too. I need to make money, have housing, buy food, have health care, pay for my kids' video games, whatever the fuck else, be a good consumer. This thing that is happening conditions everything I do, conditions desire itself. And that is for Deleuze what can't be ignored. For Foucault, that's desire, that's power being exerted upon desire, which is, again, not wildly far off, but it's an interesting division, I think. Sorry for the ramble.
Can I ask you a question, a side question?
Sure, just real quick, I want to make sure Josh is, if he had anything else.
Oh, yeah.
No, that was fine, thanks.
All right, good. Please, Marcellus.
Yeah, is there a productive consumption?
Their productive consumption.
Yeah.
There's a lot to answer there, and I feel like so the answer is yes, because when you're talking about consumption, you're talking about connecting one machine to another, which is necessarily producing even more. But the act of consumption itself, that is the sort of consummation of a thing, it is still producing. Things produce, basically, is the short version. Things produce, events produce, they continue to produce. So there is, I think I'd be wondering, is there a consumption without production? That would presume that it's going...
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how to answer that.
I don't know, but like consumption and production connected to each other, you know, like you can be as a worker consuming and producing at the same time, right? It's kind of like an oscillation, right?
I think that like when you ask if it's productive, that's a little different than asking if it's part of a productive process. So D and G are pretty clear that it's a question of passive syntheses, at least in 1.1 to 1.4.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when you say, is it productive, you might theoretically, at least where my mind goes, be implying a type of active agent within the productive process. What Brooks is saying is that in 1.3, as the subject traverses the surface of the body without organs, they are consuming intensive quantities. Now, is that productive? It kind of depends on how you're going to define that. Consumption is in the process of production. That's going to be the third synthesis. But to say, you know, is it productive might imply an agent, and I think D&G would kind of hesitate there.
Thanks. Yes.
Holland's book on AO is great. He's got a section on the conjunctive synthesis of consumption consummation. I would recommend that as like it's like 7 paragraphs. It's not a lot, but he does talk through exactly what Noah's talking about here and goes a little bit deeper into some parts of it. So you can maybe find a place to sort of run a little bit down a road and chase some other quotes. Because again, it's because the other side of it is this is the tough part. One of the big things about this, again, to go talk about the more Marx than Marx, the idea of consumption, the consumer is produced in capitalism. Like it's one of the things that's kind of tough within Marx to sort of talk about is the nature of like, it's not that capitalism makes things and then we choose stuff. Capitalism's producing consumers that will consume the things that are being produced. Is fucking hilarious. It's almost comedic at the level that it's sort of written like that. And Deleuze and Guattari want to bring that further, again, inside. And so when we talk about our experience, and when we have the end part of this, the consummation consumption part of this, the idea of a consumer, a subject that consumes intensities as these things are produced, that subject is produced also. So the consumer is produced as part of this. Now the consumption process, it doesn't yield nothing. Like that's the whole point, is that consumption continues and will continue. So it's part of the process, it's imminent to the process, but there isn't a specific agent that is doing the thing. It is just part of the process as things are produced. And that probably made it more complicated than I needed to do. I'm sorry for that.
No, I perfectly understand that, you know, like okay. I perfectly understand it.
Okay, good. Ugh. All right. We're going to continue where, and this is such a fucking long paragraph. Another whole page. like 2 in a row. It's like just the entire fucking page. Let me see if I can shrink this down, maybe get it all to fit in a single. Fuck, it's already so small. We'll see what we can do. There's a lot here. Where's gonna be my break point? Where's gonna be my break point? I need a break point. Yeah, I'm gonna stop here, and we're gonna do the first half. Then we're gonna read the second half. We're gonna analyze the first half, and then analyze the second half. We're gonna try to have a break point because it's such a fucking long paragraph. It's longer in the French. I think both of these are actually one paragraph in the French. So, good Lord. Good Lord. But this is, to continue what we were talking about with JK, this is the conversation around specifically placing the family outside the social field. This is the way that it's 2.5 pages. Homomorphism. I've got the French up too, and I'm like, because I'm always checking. Sometimes they break a paragraph into 3 or 4. Here they did it, and I'm kind of glad they fucking did. Jesus. But this is going back, family outside of the social field. Again, the social field was determined by filiative and alliant relations for a very long time. Very long time. Very long time. But it's not now. It's not at all, like, in any way. This placing of the family outside the social field is also its greatest social fortune, for it is the condition under which the entire social field can be applied to the family. Individual persons are social persons first of all, i.e. functions derived from the abstract quantities. They become concrete in the becoming related or the axiomatic of these quantities in their conjunction. They are nothing more nor less than configurations or images produced by the point signs, the breaks flux, the pure figures of capitalism. The capitalist as personified capital, as a function derived of the flux of capital. The worker as personified labor capacity, a function derived from the flux of labor. In this way, capitalism fills its field of eminence with images. Even destitution, despair, revolt on the other side, the violence and the oppression of capital become images of destitution, despair, revolt, violence, or oppression. But starting from non-figurative figures or from the breaks flux that produce them, these images will themselves be capable of figuring and reproducing only by shaping a human material whose specific form of reproduction falls outside the social field that nonetheless determines this form. Private persons are therefore images of the second order, images of images, that is, simulacra, that are thus endowed with an aptitude for representing the first order images of social persons. These private persons are formally delimited in the locus of the restricted family as mother, father, child. Pausing there. The family is outside of the social field. Interesting. What does that mean? Well, since they're outside of the social field, they kind of exist non-socially determined, which means that all the stuff that is socially determined, the capitalist, the worker, the class relations, the literal productive processes that are in the social field through capital, people working, people spending, people investing, whatever that is. Well, that means that they over here actually represent, they can play at these various things. They take on these elements, not the actual production of it, but the image of production of it. They take on these pieces because they live outside of it. They're not determined by it. They aren't socially placed in, you are an investor because your father was an investor, despite what social pressures they may feel that that's the case. They aren't determined to be there. They can switch that out at any time. They can invest in other ways. They can become a worker. There's a lot of shit people can do. It's not socially determined the same way it was once upon a time when you were born to Steve Shoemaker. It's shoes. That was your job. Steve Blacksmith. You were a blacksmith. That was your job. These things don't exist. So these images of these different things, the honest day's work of the working man. Some of us may have that more as a feeling. Boo-hoo. That thing where families are outside of it. So as such, private persons are images of the second order. They're images of images, simulacra that are thus endowed with an aptitude for representing first-order images of social persons. These private persons are formally delimited in the locus of the restricted family as father, mother, and child. This is how Oedipus is forming. This is the thing. JK, we're getting there, I promise. Now to continue. We'll do questions. We're going to go back through all of it because it's a lot, but I want to make sure we stop there. So now we've got private persons who are sort of play acting or images of images, simulacra of social positioning, right? But instead of being a strategy that through the action of alliances and filiation opens onto the entire social field, is coextensive with it, and countersects its coordinates, it would appear that the family is now merely a simple tactic around which the social field closes, to which it applies its autonomous requirements of reproduction, and that it counteracts with all its dimensions. The alliances and filiations no longer pass through people, but through money. So the family becomes a microcosm, suited to expressing what it no longer dominates. In a certain sense, the situation has not changed, for what is invested through the family is still the economic, political, and cultural social field, its breaks and flux. Private persons are an illusion, images of images, or derivatives of derivatives. But in another sense, everything has changed, because the family, instead of constituting and developing the dominant factors of social reproduction, is content to apply and envelop these factors in its own mode of reproduction. Father, mother, child thus become the simulacrum of the images of capital, Mr. Capital, Madam Earth, and their child the worker, with the result that these images are no longer recognized at all in the desire that is determined to invest only in their simulacrum. The familial determinations become the application of the social axiomatic. A lot in this huge paragraph for this. But this is the shift. Hey, once upon a time, the family you were born to literally had coordinates and like a studyable location. I can show you the fucking pages if you want of like Strauss's work to like map out social relations of tribes. Not saying it's accurate, but you could do it. And it was pretty close. It was this one was positive, this is negative, this is this, all these things. Great. Family, coextensive with the social, coextensive. Now private, and taking from society roles. The dad making himself, and we have this in the West for sure, the dad making himself the arbiter of justice, the lawgiver, the one who lays down the rules. When your father gets home, you won't believe. Don't make me take my belt off, etc., etc. I don't know if it applies as much anymore. Pretty sure it applies a lot. The mom, the one figure is more demure, caring, object of affection, object of desire. These positions that exist in this milieu of massive shit that used to be where we were socially determined, we're play acting. We're play acting. And it's really weird because what we're play acting is kind of all of that. So because the images, desire is still there. Desire is still pumping. Once through us, desire found its paths in horrifying ways, probably in a lot of these early cultures, but it found its paths to reproducing, doing this, building this up, doing whatever it needed to. Desire was able to invest directly into the social world. Desire always does. Now desire doesn't really have coordinates. It doesn't really know where to go or who to invest in. It had the king at one point. That's at least something. Desire to be investing in sort of a global body as a thing. But now it's through capital. Now it's distributed. Not in mom and dad, not directly. Now it's in their images or the images that they're putting forward. The family is putting forward, your sister, your brother, your uncle, whatever it may be. Desire is investing in their images, not their position in society. Not a material position, the image of that position, the simulacra of it. I know there's no paragraph right here in the French. I know. It's worth pointing out. There is no paragraph break here in the French. There is in the English. We are going to take it because I think this goes for another 2 pages in it. Pretty sure it does actually. Jesus Christ, it does. Yeah, it goes all the way to, oh my God. So, to restate, sorry, go ahead.
Brooks?
Yeah.
So in the previous paragraph and in this paragraph, I noticed the word countersex, and it didn't feel like a word that D&G would use, so I looked at it in French, and it's more of like a recutting. And I was wondering like why
is it recupera?
Yeah.
Fuckers. Fucking goddamn it.
So yeah, because I was like, I looked at the French and I don't see the word like contra, right? You know, so I was wondering why it was bothering me so much, and I think it's because like the word countersex makes me think of like I don't know, like a completely new kind of path, like taking a path and putting it.
It's the opposite of an intersection. It's a countersection. It's
right, and I think recut implies more of an intersection where you take these like existing segments, right, and then you kind of you don't form a new path, but you make alterations to this one, and this is where it gets tricky with someone like Baudrillard, because in Baudrillard's hyperreality, the signs are self-referential. They don't refer to any other sign, and it seems like D&G would agree here with the word countersex, whereas I feel like a recutting implies like an alteration to something existing to show that signs, you know, are not self-referential. They're always linked, right?
It's a tracing. It's much more like a tracing, or, and again, recutting works really nicely because again, they've been talking about the cuts of the Brake's flux, and again, that's the context of this. Is it literally? It's, God damn it.
So it's like the father, the mother, and the child as a simulacrum doesn't mean that it exists in some hyper reality that's devoid of any meaning, and they only have meaning in the context of themselves. Everything is fundamentally interconnected here with how capitalism is able to sort of craft or recut these kind of private people to sustain itself, or at least like socially reproduce itself through the family.
So deeply frustrated. Sorry, I'm just like looking at the French text, and I'm like, there's a lot. There's actually a lot here that is just having issues. That's fine. God damn it. There's a couple lines that I think do work and are worth sort of being very particular on. And that is the idea of the family. They have this phrasing, instead of the family being a strategy through which, through alliances and affiliations, opens onto the social field, is coextensive with it and intersects its coordinates. That thing that they're talking about, again, is how a family existed socially in the Earth Socius, and also under the despotic, really, because it was, the family was a strategy to survive. You had a very particularized structure because you had, you know, again, emergent from the position of desire itself, you can make more people to work in the field, or you can work with someone else. The best way to work with someone else is if you have things in common. The easiest thing in common is have people married and have children in common, and then have these big, large families with large amounts of land that are kind of all interconnected. And the strategy of that, where family is deeply coexistent with the social field, it's like insanely irrelevant now. But it's not gone. It's that the image of that has been sort of reapplied. Again, simulacra is the right word for this. I think you're right that he would probably be alongside with Baudrillard on that. There's a little bit more play with it, I think, for Deleuze. He has a wonderful essay on the simulacra in Logica Sense, the Penguin edition, which has a bunch of extra things. He wrote a lot on it. Simulacra is a really big deal for him. But it's just frustrating. That's frustrating. Family determinations become the application of social axiomatics. The family becomes the subset to which the entirety of the social field is applied. Since everyone has a father and mother in private, it's a distributive subset that simulates for each person the collective ensemble of a social person. This is interesting. Yeah, that's the next little bit, and it's slightly off every time. God damn. All right, just to keep to this paragraph and not to rabbit hole on, I need to not rabbit hole on translation issues. Not rabbit hole on translation issues. I will have enough time to do that right after the stream. Noah and I will probably, more than likely. But for now, questions, thoughts, where are you at? Making more sense? Is it working so far? Are you following generally what they're putting down? The answer is no. That's okay too.
This phrase here, you know, where he talks about the father, mother, child, thus becomes the simulacrum of the images of capital. And in parentheses, he has Mr. Capital, Madam Earth, and their child, the worker. So that's a hierarchical image, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like, you know, Mr. Capital is like the isn't that this kind of a stand-in for a master signifier then?
Yes. Well, an image of one. Be very careful to say an actual, it's not an actual master signifier. But again, the axiomatized nature of what we're talking about is that the father or someone is the law, that there is the law, that you must, like this axiomatized nature of things is what they're driving at. It's not that there is a master signifier. It's that there's the after image of a master signifier. I think that's how I'd put it. Yeah, I'd probably say it that way. Yeah. I mean, it's that last bit. Sorry, so go ahead, Marcellus.
Does this image is a rule or just an image in a human sense or in a Kantian sense? Because an image contain a rule, I guess. I don't know.
I think it would be in the. I would lean towards the Humean sense, although I think it would be interesting to have a discussion on. They probably wouldn't land that differently in terms of like how they're using it here, because when we talk about the image of, and then now we have the reenacting of that thing, this simulacrum, the copy of a copy, because again, the image socially also is not the. It's not like it's the original. So we have these copies of copies. We have simulacra in the family. When we have Mr. Capital, Madam Earth, Child the Worker, these are images, simulacra being sort of replicated. So it's within capital, what image specifically means is, again, all of the pieces of that brought together in very particular ways. And this is, again, done through desires, production, and the axiomatizing nature of it.
Because in the previous reading, we talked about the capitalist representation, right? And how it connect to a particular thing, something that is particular, that can extend to a universal general thing, right? The representation of father, the representation of mother, the representation of an uncle, or in general, right?
Yes.
And how like these you know, multiplicity qua multiplicity, right? These things are, when we try to equate them, like it doesn't represent a universal particular, right? In a sense that, like, you know, you have this representation, right, which is an image, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. Image of an image that the simulacra that are crowded, right, as he described it. But the question is, does it connect to the it's connect to both? It's connect to the social production, and at the same time the desire and production, right? And like how this relate to the social axiomatic, right? How this like process relate to social axiomatization, right?
Mm-hmm.
How yeah, the question is how this process, you know, we talked about capitalist representation, we talked about the, you know, the image and how the representation relate to the image, and how, you know, you have particular representation in capitalist representation. You have a particular representation, right, that is beyond symbolic, beyond the sign, beyond like any mere signs or these kind of things, right? So how it connect to the axiomatization? That's
Well,
my
all right.
question.
Well, with
How
that, I think we're going to go to the next paragraph, which is, I think, answering that. I'm like, I would love to answer it, but I feel like I'd be a dick to not, like, because that's you're hitting on exactly what this chapter is about. Like, that is the question that's happening here. How do these things lead to the axiomatization and the repression of desire in the way that capitalism does? So, spot fucking on. Like, you're asking literally the question you're supposed to have in your head, I think, right before we move forward. Before we move forward, though, Drew asks, so the image or simulacra is like a tracing, but it's also interwoven. So think of the anachronisms of the social world that have been held onto, the kings, the queens, the matriarchal, patriarchal, the nuclear family, all of these things that at one point were socially determined. They didn't sit around and go, boy, we need nuclear families. It's not really how it happened. These things are sort of emergent over time based on a lot of social reproduction and production. Once upon a time, whether it was matriarchal or patriarchal, there's a lot of really fascinating cultures out there, but there were structures in families that were built around the reproduction, the marrying, and the alliances with other tribes. That's actually fairly universal. What those shapes were and how they were built kind of varied because of a lot of different things, especially like the actual literal material conditions of the tribe. But they involved someone in power, generally, people being married off, a parent in some sort of hierarchical system, things like that, that at some point morphed into the king, the fiefdoms, the dukes, things like that, that had these hierarchical things built right into the social order. Again, coextensive with it. The family was coextensive. Now we have a liberal society that doesn't need any of this shit. It really doesn't. But it's not like we can just sloughs off. These things are still part and parcel of the entirety of how social world is built. And when people look at the world, they want to see family because they grew into a family. They were part of a family in some capacity. The images of family, the thing that family means, or that father means, or mother means, or whatever it may be, we look out into the world, we want to see that. We produce that. So capitalism produces that. And then in the family, we reproduce it again as an image of an image, even if it doesn't have the same socially determined need as it used to. Like, it just doesn't. But the image is cool. It feels good. And so we do that. And so there's this odd thing in this private family where it's copying the rest of the social field as an after image instead of where it was before, which is within the social field and determined by it. Basically, if you can imagine, the social family was determined socially and was in socially. And if you just extracted that group out, it would look like a nuclear family. It wouldn't work the same in those old worlds, but if you extract it, it looks like this. And we like those after images. We really like that a lot. It feels good. And we go, oh, family. Freud built the entire Oedipus complex on this very particular, type of family. They happen to be in certain ways, and it's the after image very often. So it's you guys are going back and forth. I'll let you go back and forth for a few minutes. I'm going to read the next paragraph, which is technically the same paragraph. The family becomes the subaggregate to which the whole of the social field is applied. Since each person has his own private father and mother, it is a distributive subaggregate that simulates for each person the collective whole of social persons, and that closes off his domain and scrambles his images. Everything is reduced to the father-mother-child triangle, which reverberates the answer, daddy-mommy, every time it is stimulated by the images of capital. In short, Oedipus arrives, is born in the capitalist system of the application of first-order social images to the private familial images of the second order. It is the aggregate of destination that corresponds to an aggregate of departure that is socially determined. It is our intimate colonial formation that corresponds to the form of social sovereignty. We are all little colonies, and it is Oedipus that colonizes us. When the family ceases to be a unit of production and of reproduction, when the conjunction again finds in the family the meaning of a simple unit of consumption, it is father-mother that we consume. In the aggregate of departure, there is the boss, foreman, the priest, the tax collector, the cop, the soldier, the worker, all the machines and territorialities, all the social images of our society. But in the aggregate of destination, in the end, there is no longer anyone but daddy, mommy, and me. The despotic sign inherited by daddy, the residual territoriality assumed by mommy, and the divided split castrated ego. Isn't this operation of flattening, folding? I want to say this again. I really like this part. Isn't this operation of flattening, folding, or application what leads Lacan to say, willingly betraying the secret of psychoanalysis as an applied axiomatic. What appears to, quote, come most freely into play in what is called the analytic dialogue, in fact depends on a sub-foundation that is perfectly reducible to a few essential and formalizable articulations, end quote. Everything is preformed, arranged in advance. The social field, where everyone acts and is acted upon as a collective agent of enunciation, an agent of production and anti-production, is reduced to Oedipus, where everyone now finds himself cornered and cut along the line that divides him into an individual subject of the statement and an individual subject of enunciation. The subject of the statement is the social person, the subject of enunciation, the private person. So, it's your father, so it's your mother, so it's you. The familial conjunction results from the capitalist conjunctions, insofar as they are applied to private persons. Daddy, mommy, me. One is sure to re-encounter them everywhere, since everything has been applied to them. The reign of images is the new way in which capitalism utilizes the schizzes and diverts the flows. Flux, goddammit, Brooks. Composite images. Images flattened onto other images, so that when this operation reaches its outcome, the little ego of each person related to its father-mother is truly the center of the world. Much more underhanded than the subterranean reign of the fetishes of the earth or the celestial reign of the despot's idols is the advent of the Oedipal narcissistic machine. Quote, no more glyphs and hieroglyphs will have the objective reality, our Kodak vision to every man, to every woman. The universe is just a setting to the absolute little picture of himself, herself. A picture, a Kodak snap in a universal film of snaps, end quote. Each person as a triangulated microcosm. The narcissistic ego is identical with the Oedipal subject. As a kid, how do you experience the world? Through mom and dad. You do, it's through them. Like you learn about things through one of them. Like you have two parents. If you have one parent, maybe only one, but still you got the mom and dad. You got this thing where all of the world ends up being collapsed, and this person is their job to sort of teach you and tell you about it, to ingrain upon you the importance of X, Y, or Z, to give it to you, to be your refuge, to be your home, to be whatever it is. All these things, all this stuff becomes that person, that thing. There's a weird prearranging that's happening there because it happens to be something that is sort of rebuilt across society, this prearranging, this pre-setup. The thing that's happening in the family no longer is coextensive with the social field, but now a sort of replication of it happens because the child isn't just learning out and about immediately upon social mores or in social coordinates through a massively complex family structure that really spans across alliances and thousands, hundreds of people, dozens of people. Now it's mommy, daddy, mostly. Maybe aunt and uncle, maybe. That's your best bet. Here's hoping. But you don't really have that. Instead, everything is put in here. They outline it. The despotic sign inherited by daddy, residual territoriality assumed by mommy, the divided, castrated ego. This operation of flattening, folding, application is Lacan's line where he says, well, actually, everything can be reduced to these formalizable articulations. Everything is preformed, arranged in advance. The social field, where everyone acts and is acted upon as a collective agent of enunciation, an agent of production and anti-production. All of this is reduced to Oedipus because we were all raised by Oedipus, preformed by Oedipus. Oedipus built us because this is how families work. This is how the setup puts us through. That we have mom and dad teaching us these things. We see those things through the eyes of mom and dad. We learn about bosses, work through mom and dad. We learn about sex. We learn about relationships. We learn about learning. We learn about video games. We learn about movies, everything through mommy, daddy, me. Everything is this triangulation. And everything is through them and replicated by them. So it's an image of an image. It's no longer directly socially determined. It's now them sharing with me, them sharing with me, them sharing with me, them sharing with me, flattening images onto other images, bringing other images in. So this operation builds out this little ego of each person and makes sure it's always related. This Brooks, this you that is built, is truly the center of this world, always related to mother, father, because mother and father are everything. This, as they say, is much more underhanded than the subterranean reign of the fetishes of the earth, what the earth does, and how the fetishes of the idols or other things inside of the earth, that's subterranean, that's deep in the earth, or the celestial reign and the idealistic of the despot's idols, the godhead, the pharaoh, the king, whatever it is. This is a narcissistic machine. This is the setup that's happening here. Each person becomes a microcosm of the entire society. A narcissistic ego identical with the Oedipal subject. Everything folded into that triangle. Everything. Hope that makes sense, JK, specifically, because you've been waiting. This is Oedipus at last. This is it. This is it, JK.
Could you explain the fetishistic idol?
Could. I'd have to go back much earlier. Give me 2 seconds.
No. The line below this page.
Yeah.
There's the first line. The last line, I think.
Yeah, it's there. So, fetishes of the earth, the despot's idols, the reign of desire, how desire becomes sort of controlled and set up. The earth, for example, the earth socialist that falls back, and you give credit to the earth, or the despot who falls back. One of the things that they use are these fetishes or idols. They form in various ways, but they're ultimately intended to be sort of a think of it as like a bursting point of desire or a fixative point that we can sort of look at and go, oh, this is giving me luck. This is going to give me love. Oh, this is the idol. This gives our country love. This is the pharaoh. This is the king. This is the king's jewels, whatever the fuck it is. This setup, this is what we're able to worship. We're able to pay homage to, the fetishes or the idols. In capitalism, we're it. We're the thing. That's the thing. We don't have glyphs or hieroglyphs anymore. It's a great quote. I'm pretty sure this is going to be, if I had to guess, it is, it feels like it's going to be, it doesn't matter. No more glyphs or hieroglyphs. We'll have the real objective reality. Our Kodak vision, photos, Kodak. For you children who may be listening, Kodak was a film company that made cameras and film. To every man, every woman, the universe, a setting to the absolute little picture of himself or herself. A picture that's we used to call selfies. Kodak snap, we used to call photos. In the universal film of snaps. Everyone having this photo, this narcissistic moment, this subjective view of my reality, myself. I am the thing to worship within my space. Quite literally. That's the
MySpace.
I know. It ended. It was almost, I was about to make a comment like, well, that's a perfect way to end that sentence because it is literally the point. Knew it was D.H. Lawrence. God damn it.
So if I can make a comment here really quickly, because I think I might be a little confused or just need some clarification.
Please.
This kind of paragraph, at least in French, it's all one big paragraph. So you just read two, but that's one big paragraph. And in this paragraph, DNG are still referring to the family as these kind of like images, like Mr. Capital, Madam Earth, and their child, the worker. Mm-hmm. So to clarify, DNG aren't necessarily, saying that, you have to grow up within this, I have a mom and dad and, in that kind of family. Like you could be in, foster care. You could grow up with a friend. You could grow up with your grandparents. It doesn't matter because Mr. Capital and Madam Earth are still there. There's still that division between capital and nature. And we are born of that and always taught that. And the family is a very easy unit in order to kind of be instilled that, I guess, like quote unquote social repression in a way. Am I getting that?
I mean, yes, but I would also add,
we keep saying mommy, daddy as these two
their
individual
critique,
people.
their critique of the concept of how mental illness is treated and the production of humanity is important when we talk about this, because very, very much, if you look at Lacan, or you look at, I mean, oh, he's a serial killer. Oh, I bet you he didn't have a good relationship with his parents. Like just the general social way we talk about these things. The people who are mentally non-normative or off kilter or not in a healthy space very much come from, we talk about broken homes, who grew up in the system. Like again, people are produced, and they're produced through these things in our social order, and what they're not able to connect to socially, what they're not able to be sort of a part of, is kind of what they're talking about here. That the healthy person, the Oedipalized person who may be slightly neurotic here or this way here or blah, 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 that these things come about because this model of a thing is here. It doesn't necessarily need to be a man and a woman as father, mother. That's very much not what they're talking about. They're saying underneath the Oedipal complex and the conception of it is this other problem. And they're not, there's a lot of things they're not saying. A lot of people presume it means that they, like the family needs to be abolished. I'm not even sure they'd go that far. It's the family as it exists and the way that representation works. And also the way we regard people who are healthy or not, or socially adjusted or maladjusted. These kinds of things are, I mean, we're 50 years on, not much of that has changed. So when we talk about like how someone is raised in this nuclear family, the conservatives are still on about it, furious about it in basically every way they can be. But even the liberal order is talking about the breakdown of the nuclear family as a thing. And why? Well, it's because we don't have workers doing this, or kids aren't doing this, or we have this or that happening. This thing that we very much intimately understand, that the family's job is to replicate the social order of things. It does more than just create this, oh, I have a better understanding of society. What it does is it actually builds a structure within you that you are the thing to worship, that the consumer of yourself, the consumption of your own intensities, that thing that's doing it, the ego, the narcissistic play, is the outcome. The same way that in capitalism, we laud the consumer, a proper good consumer who's very good at what he does, and we laud that. This just turns that inwards towards the family. So it's more complex than just saying they're saying, oh, it's copy's over. It's like there's a lot more at play here because of, again, the development of subjectivity that happens in this way. I probably didn't answer that very well. I probably made it more complicated, but yeah, that's the idea.
No, thank you. I think that clarified things. I think my fear is sometimes like falling into the trap of saying like the family is completely countersected or separate or divorced from, the social field, because when we say that that the family is kind of a reflection of society, we also have to remember that like the society is, equally a reflection of the family. Like these things are fundamentally interwoven and can't be divorced. So I guess, I don't know, in my mind, it seemed like regardless of who you are, we all have the parents of, Mr. Capital and Madam Earth. And we are all, as a society, kind of, born from that intersection between industry, or from that false dichotomy between industry and nature. But I also see... Well, just real quick,
because on that note, the big thing here, and it's implied, and they're going to be talking about it in just a moment, is that the image that desire invests in is a false image of itself. Because if this is, again, the family of old, back in the Earth Socius, the formation, desire was able to invest directly into the social space and find its ability to connect exactly as the family sort of existed. So the family became an affirming direction for desire to sort of follow. What we have now is very different than that. It's a very false image. And just to read a little bit of this from Holland. Hence the importance of the critique of representation to the schizoanalytic critique of Oedipus. In delegating the formation of desire to the nuclear family as system of reproduction representation, capitalism manages to trap desiring production in a deceptive or misleading image of itself, the familial content of which is mostly irrelevant, even while the form of that desiring production ultimately echoes and reinforces precisely the kind of repression exercised by capitalist social production itself, as we have just seen. And then he reads off a few bits. Desiring production and social production are thus, in a descriptive sense, one and the same process, inasmuch as schizoanalysis sees no need and no room to posit any independent universal formation of desire, such as Oedipus, intervening between one and the other. Yet in a critical sense, desiring production and social production are different, inasmuch as schizoanalysis enables and expects us to judge any historical organization of social production according to the eminent criteria provided by desiring production itself. Their critique that's happening here, and there's like 15 levels of it, do not get me wrong, but at the very base of it, it's what Holland is talking about here. Desire is basically becoming malformed at the fount. And that's the challenge of what they're going for. Oedipus, at the very end, where we have all of these things going, we have all these after images, these simulacra of things that are being placed in the family. It's not that they're going, oh, mommy, daddy, and they're actually Oedipalized. It's that desire, which is productive, connective, it does not lack up front. Desire is forming itself into these things and then finding itself everywhere in order to continue to form triangles like mommy, daddy, me, everywhere else, which replicate that shape. When we talked about the axiomatic, this would be the deal, because the axiomatic, how do you make a triangle? Well, you make it by having three angles like this. No, a triangle is these 3 points like this. It is, not how it's made. Axiomatic versus the problematic. The axiomatic way to go about it, as capitalism loves, is here's the form of things. This is the triangulation. You, I've got it upside down, I'm doing a triangle thing. You underneath mommy, daddy. And you connected here, you connected here. Here is how you relate to everything. And you find that triangle everywhere because that's how desire works. It replicates, it finds itself, it continues to find the pattern of its own afterimage everywhere. So you constantly are rebuilding it everywhere. That's how this works.
And that means it's always constantly changing too.
It's always changing, but
the family is like it has to be like look at the quote. Can you scroll up just a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Look at this quote right here. Hold on. It says, okay, down a little more. Anti-production. Where does it say anti-production? The social field where everyone acts and is acted upon. Do you see that sentence?
Yes.
It says, as the collective agent of enunciation and agent of production, anti-production is reduced to Oedipus. See, it says in French, c'est rabat sur. It's saying that the BWO falls back upon, Oedipus. And,
Yes.
and as we know, that means that it's going to try and, that means Oedipus is in a constant state of flux. If that's the case,
no. So this is the challenge. So Oedipus, you could say, is in a constant state of flux in probably some way, but I don't think that's what they're doing here. Instead, the reduction to Oedipus is the superstructure that is at play here. It is the axiomatized version of desire. So when we have everything is preformed, arranged in advance, the social field, where everyone acts and is acted upon as a collective agent of enunciation, an agent of production and anti-production, is reduced to Oedipus. It's always reduced back to that. I find my father, find my mother, find this organization of things, this body without organs, for lack of a better phrasing of it. This is where the sort of instincts of, and again, because all this is desire, instinct, these other things, this is where anti-production is infused and suffused throughout capital. These things, as they're being sort of laid out and capital being arranged, the axiomatized side of things is what is being reproduced. I don't know if that helps. That probably doesn't help.
No, it makes sense, and that's how Oedipus is able to be upheld as Oedipus, because it falls back upon the very process that produces Oedipus, like fucking all the time. But I guess at least my reading of like say rabbit sir and the three syntheses is that even as the BWO falls back upon everything, it pushes, it resists the desiring machines with this sort of counter fluidity as it's falling upon, which means that Oedipus is not the same. It's constantly being needed to, it's constantly needing to be produced in the same way that the family is. But is there not some level of change within that? Like the family today
this is
the family yesterday.
Okay, so the reason the triangulation is important here is because when we're talking about the three syntheses, specifically the disjunct, right, which is kind of the important one. It's kind of a big one. But when we talk about the disjunctive, the place anti-production shows up is here. Anti-production basically ceases a connection, interrupts, which enables an infinitude of other connections. If it's an inclusive disjunction. It's not. If it is an either or mommy daddy, because it's been triangulated, then that anti-production sliding between stopping the connection stops it. Either or. It is this or it is that. Not either or, which infinite possibilities. If we were in an inclusive disjunction situation, very different beast, but we're not. Exclusive disjunctions because of the nature of mommy or daddy. Binary. Mommy, daddy. Everything seen through that, it places everything in that mommy or daddy, this or that, A or B, blah, 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 instead of A or B or C or D or E, blah, 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 blah. Instead of that, it reduces. And so anti-production here is doing its role, but the disjunct, because it is an exclusive, is incredibly important to that. Why is it a disjunct? Because of mommy, daddy, me. Because it is a triangulation of you against a binary, either or, not either or, that's open-ended.
Yeah, it falls back upon an exclusive disjunction.
And
that's
that's where
I fucked up.
100%. And so the exclusive disjunction and how it operates here, and the reason it sort of is playing in this way is because, again, anti-production being suffused into capital, as it is through the desk drive and these other elements, it's built into these things. Everything becomes either or. And so, again, instead of the open-ended inclusive disjunction as it can go, which it could operate, instead the axiomatization of mommy daddy places the either or exclusive disjunction here.
But why is the family or mommy, daddy, whatever, not like the same thing as gender, right? If you look at gender as an exclusive disjunction, you have but you have man and woman. But even D&G are going to agree that gender is always changing. Like, what the fuck does it mean to be a man?
Sure, and family is always changing too. Family is always changing too.
So if family is always changing, how can it be an agent of social repression if we can't pinpoint what the agent is?
It is now. Because now you're free to tell me where in the West that a proper nuclear family isn't the desired position or the one that everyone is relating to in every single way. I understand that there are pockets of that not being a thing. I understand that there are pockets of gender being abolished. I would love this if this was a larger case overall. Really not. We live in that.
What I'm saying is that we can't define man. We can't define woman, like in the sense of in the sense of like obviously what we're talking about outside of gender essentialism. So how can we define the family, and is it important to do so?
Oh no,
because it looks
because this is. But here's the thing. So you're doing a bit of a thing, which is you're going back to master signifier or the word on high God or what is the truth of a word. The thing is, and as they're talking about here, you as being raised as an individual, as the narcissistic ego element, mommy, daddy, man, woman, you are the one that defines it. All of us are defining it equally. We all define it because of these various things, the way these images have played into our families. And we may have very different versions of it, but this is where that happens. It is the egotistical consumer that is placed at the center of consumption that is doing all of this, as they, I think, outright say, actually. Each person a little triangular microcosm, the narcissistic ego identical with the Oedipal subject. This is that thing. You are the setup that is re-encountering your signs everywhere. Now we're bending them when we talk to people a little bit. We go, oh, man, woman, I have very different versions of what a man is because of who my father was, and a woman is because of my mother. Other people may have very different versions of all of these things.
Yeah, but I'm universalizing the family for everyone, dude. Oh my God.
So
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, so when we don't have the despotic signifier, and again, there's an appeal to that is very built into written word and spoken word, and people still talk about it. When we do away with that, which we've done away with a long time ago, instead this hyper-subjective world that is objective to each egotistical being, the narcissistic ego that exists, you're replicating what you see everywhere. And so you're defining it as you see everywhere. This is why we end up in really weird positions where people are talking about man or woman, but they mean very different things, or race or anything else, because again, we're seeing it through this very particularized binary through an exclusive disjunction, because the ego as the consumer of that is kind of the final bit at the end of it. The reign of images is the new way in which capitalism utilizes schizzes and diverts flux. Composite images images flattened on other images. So when this operation reaches its outcome of the little ego of each person related to its father, mother, is truly the center of the world. Not speaking universally like, oh, Steve's the center of the world. Fuck, we should go talk to Steve. It's instead each of us, what we saw, our triangulation is the center of the world. Does that make sense, Noah?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's literally the line.
Like, yeah, it's the line you were talking about. Yeah,
yeah, and it's literally the line we were talking about. Sorry.
And then that's the stuff. Those are the things that in French, I think, are stated a little bit more strongly because of the way that plurality works in their language. They are very much talking about everyone as individuals in their own. And again, this is the phrasing they use, every child with his own tinker toys. Like they say things like this, like because they're talking about it in that way, that in capitalism, the ego is the thing. The ego is not a universal thing. We don't all come to the same understanding of stuff, but we come to the same, we have the same images that build the representations in us within our family, which is privatized. And we see the rest of the world through this family, that then we go out in the world and we visit and we demand that everything, you know, is part of that triangulation, and it fucks with us in a lot of ways as these things collide. You got Trumpers are an easy example of this, where they all ultimately want like a strong daddy figure, and they talk about it like this, a strong leader who will do stuff. Like all of them may or may not have had strong fathers. Quite literally, probably most of them didn't. Some of them may have, but as they were integrated into that social milieu and they found their triangles overlapping, they found ways to integrate those social images as well, again, into that triangle with them as the center. Marcellus, you had a thing.
I don't know if I understand that, but like it's kind of remind me of like the imaginary, right? Where the first alienation of desire is linked to the concrete phenomena, and if play is the value of to the child, it is because it constitutes the plane of reflection in which kind of he sees he sees appearing in the other, right? In the other, and an activity that which anticipate his own, right? I don't know, like it's kind of like he kind of like jubilating and take the mastery of this fragmented desire, right? And because this desire kind of reflected in him, which means that the desire of the subject is the desire of the other, right? But we take this like, how can I say it, masochistic like thing, which is kind of like a fragment of this desire, which is the image, right? And we kind of master it, and we do this kind of repetition, right? It's not kind of an instant. This process that Deleuze talking about, it's kind of like, it's not an instant like development. It's kind of a development
from birth on over mastery. Many years.
Yeah, it's kind of mastery over desire, like the pre-development, even the pre-development.
But and remember kind of, the phrasing he uses, and it's a bit earlier, is he says that we are all small colonies, and Oedipus is what colonizes us. The phrasing there is not accidental, and he's not being specious with it. It's very much that we get to keep our archaisms as a family. We have our own unique sort of organization, but Oedipus colonizes us. It overlays itself. It places us in a position where the way desire is formed is through this. We invest socially through our parents, either or, not directly into a social field without such binaries. These things that start happening as we do this reduction of everything to this sort of overly simplistic type of imagery is the damning beginning, because since this happens, we actually talk about representation. We speak of things and images and representation as if they were, that's the end of the sentence, as if they were things, as if they were more material. They're representations that are acting within a material unconscious due to enunciation, due to these other things, but they're not sort of emergent of desire themselves. It's instead something sort of brought back on us as society sort of collapses. This is Lacan, they bring up a lot here, and I think Lacan's line here is pretty solid. It's what appears to come most freely into play is what is called the analytic dialogue. In fact, depends on a sub-foundation that is perfectly reducible to a few essential and formalizable articulations. Lacan's talking about mommy, daddy, me. He's talking about these very basic things that we can reduce all psychoanalysis down to. Well, if we can do that, we should maybe take a second and go, this doesn't really cover everything, so let's think for a moment, maybe. Like, maybe think for a second.
Yeah. I would have a joke, but like, do you watch Shrek? Have you watched Shrek?
Of course.
Yeah. Do you remember when Shrek said that like humans like onions, right? So I remember the ego like an structuration of desire that like have an onion layers, right? Sorry.
No, it's when we think about when we think about generalized subjectivity, it's important first off to remember that how we're seeing the world is through this lens. And it's a very particularized lens built through us in the very organized, and organized is a very important term that I try to actually make sure I put a pause in there, because we are talking about the organization of things. When we're talking about the body without organs, or we're talking about productive organs, this organization is a phraseology that matches with this, because it is about organizing things and saying what things do and how things work together. It pre-organizes. It treats as though this is what these things are capable of, either or, not potentiality, but instead axiomatized endings, not problematized. So there's a lot of things in there, and that's this next paragraph. I'm going to go ahead and read the next paragraph real quick. JK, go for it.
Yeah, the capitalist axiomatization is so, he describes it, from the beginning, before Oedipus, as a very powerful, force of the market economy. So does he really need Oedipus to as a victim of patriarchal castration, to capture, the individual?
It's not to capture the individual; it's to capture desire.
Right, capture desire. Yeah. But wouldn't if the capitalist axiomatization is so dominant, could he explain capitalist desire without Oedipus?
Could he explain capitalist desire without Oedipus?
Yeah, because I think he's trying to take into account Freud's.
I think he's talking about the contingent capitalist desire we have, which I don't think can be explained without Oedipus.
Okay.
All right. To talk about capitalist desire as a thing, I think. I'm echoing through you. Sorry, JK.
What's that?
I'm echoing through you. You can mute real quick. So they're talking about capitalist desire sort of becoming axiomatized. Now, that process, and there's a few things that are really important. Socially, at large, one of the things that's really interesting is that we've always made sure to capture desire. Important because we're terrified of desire that freely does whatever it wants. It may end society. For example, it's not hard for me to say, hey, if you guys just do whatever the fuck you want and you don't think of other people, like literally we may not only have one more generation of people, or we all might die tomorrow. Like, yeah, sure, we can see this. Like there's some part of you that hope, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but that like gets, oh yeah, we want to capture desire. We want to make sure that people don't just do whatever the fuck they want to do. That we understand how these things.
Wants are not desire though; they're counter products.
Yes.
But
I agree.
When freeing desire, that doesn't necessarily entail a freeing of wants, because D&G are pretty clear that capitalism has abundant production and it has to instill in us the necessity to want to accumulate more, right? So just because you free desire, why does that necessarily mean people are going to be going crazy and killing everyone. I mean, I
Well,
don't.
I was more talking about the earth socius and despotic. But yes, I mean, this carries through. I probably should have been a little bit more specific. At the base of society, we have, again, desiring production that is also social production. Desiring production is everything. Desire runs through all of it. And desire that is not coded in the earth socius was terrifying. Desire that didn't have an overcoding by the king was seen as disgusting and off-site. For us specifically, desire that is not in line with production is a waste, absurd, and mad. Crazy. What a crazy person. Like, very much specifically. The way desire is captured in those earlier systems or sort of held in place or repressed is through one, scarification in the carving of the skin, the literal recording process, coding desire into very particularized places, overcoding it by a king. We don't have that anymore. Capital is happily destroying codes across the board as much as it wants. So desire, because the state is still part of capital, how is desire handled? And it's handled through axiomatization. And it's that way because we're basically breaking everything down into their smallest, almost mathematical points. And instead of allowing those points to become problematic, we axiomatize them, which basically puts us in a position of here is what the shapes that those things are allowed to be. Here is how those things work. That's it. Here is how these sets come together. Here are the rules of these sets. Here is what the setup is. And it can add more as it needs to. It's fine. It's a sort of like a weird meta coding of desire that happens because it starts much earlier rather than coding desire at the end of the process. It's happening much earlier by organizing where desire is allowed to be invested or where it's allowed to split or those things. So Oedipus specifically comes into this. Oedipus is not necessary for this repression. This is why the book being called Anti-Oedipus, I'd like to say it is not about Oedipus. Oedipus is a foil, is a paper tiger, is a representational system of how desire is handled that at that point is able to be pushed elsewhere, that is able to be handled and taken care of, able to be socially handled, able to be, as Freud would say, sublimated in some way. We need to talk about desire in a specific way. Axiomatic does this. And so the Oedipus setup, and this is, again, Anti-Oedipus, they're very ready to just throw out the idea of Oedipus, because they're in response to Lacan and Freud is a big part of this. Lacan and Freud believe Oedipus is primordial, that it's poured to us, that it's before everything, that absolutely everyone who needs to be adjusted needs to be Oedipalized. And this is what causes people to be crazy or not, or have certain beliefs. And D&G are breaking all of that apart by exploding psychoanalysis and saying, look, it's actually not Oedipus that's really the thing everyone needs. In fact, Oedipus as a thing, psychoanalysts or other people are able to reduce everything back to these points, even if people are actually invested in the images of things in a disparate multitude of ways. I can, when someone comes in and I can go, hey, do you have a problem with your father? Whatever the fuck it is, I can relate it back to their dad. So can they. So can you. You can relate it back to a parent. Whatever the fuck we want to talk about, you can find a way to connect it back to a parent. You're the center of things. You get to do that. That's how it works. And so psychoanalysis is this fucked up trick that, as they say, Lacan gives the game away when he says everything can be reduced to these. It's like, yeah, that's kind of fucked up, dude. Why not instead realize that this relationship people have in the way the world works gives them the ability to relate everything back to mommy and daddy, but it is not that they are actually Oedipalized. Instead, what's happened is that the way that people are raised in our society, because the family is privatized, everything is experienced through mom and dad and therefore is relatable to mom and dad. But they're not related in the way that they're investing directly in dad or mom. They're investing in those social things, but only an image of it through dad and mom. A more complex operation, but a mistake on the psychoanalytic side, on the Freudian side, to say that it's just mommy and daddy. That's the difficulty of this, is they're levying a deep critique against Oedipus. They're not saying there's no such thing as the Oedipus complex. Someone can become over-fixated on mom and dad. Absolutely. People are fucking wacky. They do all kinds of shit. They're saying it's not that everyone needs to be Oedipalized and that we need to be castrated and that this type of very particular coordination is what's needed. No. The reason everything can be related back is because we've privatized the goddamn family. We've privatized raising kids, so everything can be related to mom and dad. And if you do that, lo and behold, it's all laid out for you. It's pre-prepared. The world is set before you saying, here's mom and dad. Fuck, that is my dad. Oh my God, that's just like what happened with my mom. I can do that over and over and over, and so can my psychoanalyst. That's the problem. Instead, we need to start understanding that the privatization has created a system of representation which allows this type of system for us to relate anything in sort of these weird, fuzzy, bullshitty ways that we're certain of, because we as the ego are the center of it.
So TG is offering Oedipus as one explanation of how capitalism operates by way of this triangle, right? Oedipal triangle. But they're actually just, they're leveling a critique of Oedipus because they're offering schizoanalysis as an alternative, right?
Yes. Absolutely. Just say, just to read a little bit of Holland. D&G furthermore deny the conversion to whole objects can ever be complete, refuse to interpret partial objects retrospectively in terms of Oedipus. Unified subjectivity exists only as an after effect alongside desiring machines. These latter continue to make and break connections and disjunctions among partial objects even after subjectivity arises, in ways that would therefore have to be called an-Oedipal rather than pre-Oedipal. Does that make sense, JK? These things, what we call being Oedipalized, and we've called for years, for Freud and Lacan and Zizek and a whole bunch of others, they look at, oh, people have become Oedipalized. They have a healthy relationship with mother and father. Symbolically, they understand the relationship in a very good way. And they have this set up and blah, blah, blah. That's this weird after image, because what's actually happening is people are dealing with things socially through mom and dad, and they're able to relate things through them. Because the images and the simulacra are the point. That makes sense. Symbolically understand it good. What do I mean? A healthy Oedipal relationship for Lacan is where you have understood your father as the law and accepted that authentically, and that you've accepted you cannot see your mother as an object of sexual desire, and instead are willing to put that off, defer the consumption of desire until you find a woman of your own that you can then have a child with and then become the father in. This is proper Oedipalization, is this proper relationship of the father, mother, son, which is really just an after image of all the other things we're talking about, but seen as now causative and productive of all the other things. No, this works for queer people too. Like it's not specifically that. Again, I'm using terms they used because we're talking about people who wrote in the 50s. A little bit of a different beast. But when you're talking about the position of the father, the position of the mother, we can still talk about, and I've got friends who have very odd relationships with their two dads, one of whom is distinctly the feminine, one of whom is distinctly the masculine. This type of thing carries over. And even if you have only a single parent, for example, the damage that's done to you, and again, psychoanalysts talk about it this way, the damage done to you is because you don't have this other parent and blah, blah, blah. But it's just because you can't relate anything to mom because she wasn't there, or dad because he wasn't there, doesn't mean that things are broken. But because you can't relate anything to them, they presume they then have to create the structure for that thing. Again, it's the after image of what we understand relationships to be.
Create what structure?
The triangulation of yourself against specifically a word of law in some capacity, your relationship with authority, more or less. And then on the other side, your relationship with deferring pleasure, deferring the consumption of desire.
Is it you're saying that this triangle Correlates with the Platonic tripartite soul.
Say that one more time for me. Sorry.
Yeah, I didn't understand what that mean. Like what it was.
Well, the this kind of relationship with mommy, dad, and me is a kind of it kind of correlates with the Platonic soul, right? Idea of the soul is
Yes. No, it's very much that.
tripartite.
Yes. It's the presumption of these things, again, pre-existing. And as they're writing here, and I think they've made an excellent set of arguments for, that it's not stuff that pre-existed. Instead, what it is things that fall back on production and claim it for itself. Oedipus falls back on. These things fall back on imagery and ideas that we then take to be the thing. For example, it's an easy thing any of us can do. If we have parents at all, and you go into a psychoanalyst office and they go, has anyone here ever had a bad day at work? I have. I've had a day where I hated my boss. You go in on that day and they go, you hate your boss. Tell me, what was your relationship with your father? And you, as a person, because this is how connections, you'll go, oh, my dad, well, I did have issues with my dad growing up in the way, he disciplined me. That's, you will make those connect. You will build the thing that's being asked of you because these things have been prearranged in this way. And this is the mistake they're talking about making, that the after image, the seeming after image, and this is why incest is the one they use. The after image isn't the thing. In old societies, people didn't do incest. It probably happened, but it wasn't really a thing. But there wasn't a prohibition against it. They didn't have like a rule, don't do this. Instead, they had such an affirming rule, a demand to do things that were not incest, that incest didn't happen. When we look back on it and we trace out that world, we notice this negative space and we go, oh, they must have not allowed it. They must have disallowed it. They must have prohibited it, which they didn't. But it fits. The afterimage fits when we axiomatize it that way, when we speak of what is the shape of it rather than how the shape emerged. And this, across the board, is the thing that you see people do. It's the same type of operation that you see, great one, races that don't integrate. Look, black people, they don't like to move in with white neighborhoods. Why do we want to force them to do that? That kind of conversation, which fucking actively happens all the time. Well, I mean, if you look, you can see that there's lines. This is where people, if they don't really, but is there anything doing that? Is there any productive realities behind this? Maybe redlining and other shit and a bunch of other sort of issues that are sort of creating the space where this doesn't happen. But the image of the thing, the race is not coming together. That's the line we can then draw and see the after image of, the space of representation in the same way. Oedipus is being used as a critique for us to see how we manufacture representation as a form of understanding the world in this way and how it comes about in capitalism.
It reminds me of the Kantian question at the end where he end like with the, where he end like does this like these representation, the subjective representations, does these like we kind of like give us like simplify the world, or like it's does it for pragmatical reasons or just a priori, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
say that again.
The end of Kant is, his question is it that this is the world as it's been built? Is this the world as it's been determined? Or is this the world as it was born? More or less.
Kind of like does these representations that we have, we
question?
use it after he end with the categories and the schematism and all these kind of, I don't want to divulge to Kant more, but does these like, because he made an example of about the representation of the sea, right? And how even when we like notice that there's like a depth between like the shore and the, and the far from the shore, we see like we kind of have like, even if we see the illusion in the world of phenomena, right? Or in the world of phenomena, does this like simple represent, because bear in mind, we in Kantian philosophy, in Kantian system, we still dealing with the subjective, right? The subjective synthesis, right? So I'm sorry, I'm very stupid, but like,
You're not very stupid.
but of the use of pure reason, right? We can isolate reason, right? Like as Kant said, like the understanding.
So
right?
here's where I'm going to interrupt, because specifically
Yeah.
in this Kantian turn, what you're talking about is, let me bend it back. When we get to Oedipus, how we get there is by looking at specifically the syllogisms and paralogisms of the syntheses, because that's the thing for D&G that we can use Oedipus for. Oedipus, through a critique of Oedipus, which they outline in basically all of chapter 2, we're able to actually understand desire for what it is, and be able to start to see the paralogisms that actually are born into desire through the same critique and system that Kant gave us, actually. And so when we talk about this internal critique of Oedipus, just to really quick read some Holland, the internal critique of Oedipus serves to identify and critique 5 paralogisms, which comprise Oedipal psychoanalysis by making systematically illegitimate use of the syntheses of the unconscious. Comparative analysis of the organization of energies and investments on the socias in different modes of social libidinal production then shows in the external critique of Oedipus how capitalism has cobbled together those illegitimate uses of the syntheses from previous social formations to construct and impose the Oedipus as the objective lived representation of desire under capitalism, producing ascetic subjects perfectly suited to the demands of the capitalist socius. This is essentially the brunt of what they're doing, and they're doing it through Kant. Like, well, Deleuze is. I don't know about guattari as much. For sure, Deleuze is.
You mean like in every syllogism, like, let's say because capitalist representation is like the syllogism image, right?
And it's formed through paralogisms within desiring production. And they outline those very much up front. I mean, that's essentially what chapter 2 in the book is dedicated to, is the afterward, I mean, I'm not going to go through all of them right now. I used to be able to rattle them off. It's been 2 hours. My brain's slowly dying. But it's this system that they've been able to use in order to sort of bring out, here are the paralogisms. We can actually start to see how the social and desiring production operate, see Oedipus for what it is, but also see how representation works within this and how capitalism works within all of this to continually reinforce itself. And again, Oedipus isn't the goal of this. It's just the perfect sort of place for us to do that critique.
Does this paralogism is a rule or image, the measure, the rule? Does by means
rules
of understand, like by means we first cognate
they're rules.
This rule?
They're rules. Yeah, they're rules.
The rules. Okay.
So we have the paralogism, just to sort of, because it's worth for a moment. One of the things, psychoanalysis is all of these. Displacement as a thing. Application as a thing. The double bind of psychoanalysis. The extrapolation, and then the afterword. All of these are critical to how psychoanalytic thought works in Lacan, especially in Freud, but definitely Lacan as well. And these 5 paralogisms, and they're called that because they are an improper use of the syntheses of the unconscious. Again, straight up, to me, that's Kantian, at least in terminology. And so when we talk about desire and its movement through these syntheses, things get fucked up in this way. And a paralogism builds on itself, which builds other paralogisms. And then these things sort of actually create a sort of subsystem of completely being fucked up. Like, that's basically their critique.
When we mention time, we don't mention time like, we know that it's a succession, but like the word succession is what, like, we refer to time, right? And
yeah, they mean it in the sense of they one succeeds the other, but they happen imminently to each other.
Yeah, they're gonna, like, if you're talking about like temporality in terms of like that, like they're gonna take Burke's and view time more as a duration.
Yeah, I will start with Bergson.
I would actually say Guattari's Chaosmosis has an essay, probably a couple to read, but specifically an essay called Balance Sheet for Desiring Machines that is phenomenal. Like it's I've done a reading of it after the book every time, and I've sometimes during. It's I want to say like 9 pages. It's like an interview, but he just goes into it because the stuff that he's playing with and how they're going about it, he describes differently than he does in AO and ATP, but I think he does it in a conversational way, which is nice. To read a little bit from Holland on this though. In effect, everything revolves around the body without organs, for it is here that the productive connections of desire register as signs. Such signs, being radically polyvocal, do not yet mean anything, but they do introduce into the machinery of desire the potential for variation, and therefore the possibility of error and even deceit as well. Schizoanalysis shows the Freudian Oedipus complex to comprise a set of mistakes about the nature of desire. These mistakes are understandable inasmuch as they reflect and indeed reinforce the apparent objective movement of reproduction in the nuclear family under capitalism, but they are serious mistakes, less. DNG called them the 5 paralogisms of psychoanalysis, and exposing them constitutes the backbone of the critique of Oedipus. Again, what their mission here is to do. Through Oedipus, here are the critiques, here is actually getting at how desire works, and through that, the critique of capital emerges, an auto-critique ultimately.
The popular example about that Freud treatment with Miss like the Frau K, you know, mishandling of Freud, where he named the desire on the behalf of the subject, you know, on the behalf of the patient, right? And this is for Lacan is a kind of like a error in a kind of like error in Freud technical approaches, right, where he named the desire on the behalf of the other, and if you are interested, read about in the Freud early early analysis of hysteria, right?
You're talking about Dora.
No, Frauke, the case of Frauke.
I thought it was Dora.
Lacan talks about that in the.
I thought it was Dora. That's okay. That's on me.
I think Dora.
I think the girl's name is Dora, and she accused friends of the family of molesting and other stuff. Like,
yeah, that's
I think I have, because I was pulling up. I think that's in. I think I have that. It's in. I think I've got it in one of those big case books I have of Freud's. I need to figure.
Yeah, it's very long. It's for the sake of the stream. It's very long. I didn't want to divulge, but you can find it there where Deleuze talk about this, there, right? You can find it in Lacan, in Freud paper on technique, right?
Cool. For me though, this is going to be my tapping out point. We've got a great spot to start next week, which is great. And we'll continue this because this is from here, this is the end of, and we'll probably do a chapter 4 retrospective as well after we do this section, a chapter 3 retrospective, because when we move out of this, it is a different book. This is basically building through this. Chapter 1 is going through their theory around desire and production. Chapter 2 is the critique of psychoanalysis through this and explaining how it works and also how they interrelate, and then a universal history through that. And so we get the historical, the social, the psychological, and then chapter 4 moves straight into schizoanalysis, which is their entire new way of handling all this and thinking through these things. It is a different book, and it's a lot to handle. So this next week, we'll continue through this. We'll end up doing a chapter 3 retrospective afterwards. But for now, I'm going to bounce out. I want to say thank you for joining, for all of you who did. Please, if you like what we're doing, join us on Patreon. It's the best way to sort of support us. Patreon.com/DGQC. Give a buck or two. There's not really a lot of bonuses because we don't believe in putting locked content behind paywalls, but it would help. And beyond that, thank you, and we will see you all next week. Actually, probably later tonight. Yeah, pretty much me. But later tonight, I'll probably be streaming because it is that day. It's that day, everyone. It's that day. Make America healthy again. If I didn't know you were joking. I got to tell you, it's going to be a fucking weird day. So if you want to relax, have a beer and relax. I'll be on later tonight streaming and relaxing. We'll be joining with a few friends, saying hi, bouncing around, and it's going to be a long night. It's going to be a long night. I am, and it may be wine. It may be beer. I went through a phase of what I call alcoholism. I did that for a very long time too, and a lot of other things as well. I enjoyed my youth, and my body is paying for it. But maybe we'll end up discussing wine and drugs and beer later. Yeah. So it'll probably be around 6-ish East Coast. I mean West Coast. So just a couple hours out. But keep an eye. I'll ping everyone, and we'll see. I've got to get some food in me and figure out what I even want to watch. Good Lord. All right. I'll talk to you guys soon.